Saudi Arabia has had enough. They want to join BRICS, the economic powerhouse that could challenge the West. Now, if this is true, the US dollar is doomed and the end is coming. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, spoke with Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, and expressed the desire to join the BRICS bloc. According to him, the Crown Prince did express Saudi Arabia's desire to be part of BRICS, and they are not the only country. Now, if this happens, it'll be a game changer. It's not just about Saudi Arabia supplying oil to more customers, but the destruction of the petrodollar system. An MBS proposal to join is being taken seriously during the next BRICS summit. And from the way things are going, it's just a matter of time before Saudi Arabia joins China and Russia in an alliance to protect their interests from the West. And if you're unfamiliar with BRICS, it consists of 5 major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These are economic giants. They are countries that produce real goods and commodities. And if Saudi Arabia gains entry, we are talking about a bloc that could control the energy production of the world. So why is Saudi Arabia choosing to side with BRICS and not their old partner, the United States? Because Saudi-US relations have hit rock bottom. Any semblance of mutual trust is fast eroding away. And let's recap what happened over the last few weeks. Firstly, OPEC Plus decided to cut production by 2 million barrels a day. They want to shore up prices and earn more revenue, and because of that, oil prices will stay high and the United States wasn't too happy. Then President Biden vowed consequences on Saudi Arabia. What that is, no one knows. But giving a warning to a leader of OPEC, a group that controls 60% of oil exports, isn't a smart idea. Then Saudi Arabia shot back, claiming that the Biden administration actually asked them to postpone oil cuts by a month until after the elections, and this situation is getting from bad to worse. Saudi Arabia joining BRICS is the first step in undermining the US dollar. Right now, the dollar is still sitting pretty on top of the world because it is supported by Arab oil. But once this support drains away, we could see the fall of the reserve currency and a lot of chaos erupting in the United States and across the world. So what gives the dollar its value, right? There are a lot of narratives out there, and the number one argument I hear is that the dollar is the most useful currency in the world and the global demand is high. Now that is true. Over 70% of global trade is still transacted in dollars, and over 60% of foreign debt is issued in US dollars as well. So there is an organic need for dollars in our financial system. But we need to understand what truly gives it its value. The US dollar is a currency. And like all other currencies, it is a medium of exchange for goods and services. It is an IOU, a very colorful coupon to buy stuff. And because the US and Saudi Arabia had an agreement in the 70s to price oil in US dollars only, it made the dollar the reserve currency. With just one stroke, the dollar became the most useful currency in the world. If you wanted oil, you needed to pay in dollars, and countries began stockpiling the reserve currency and started to trade with it, because at the end of the day, the dollar was as good as oil. Everything else is a derivative of this primary function. The moment Saudi Arabia or OPEC starts transacting in another currency, maybe it's the yuan or the rupee, then the dollar will experience a rug pull and fall flat. And this is why Saudi's desire to join BRICS is a reshuffling of the world order. The US has benefited from the reserve currency for decades. They enjoyed the lowest interest rates in the world. They could print money up and export inflation away with little consequences. And that's why when Russia had their dollar reserve sanctioned away, Putin had to scramble around and find alternatives. We are talking about demanding rubles for their gas and selling their energy for the Chinese yuan. We all remembered that because Russia was too reliant on the US dollar system back then. And it's because of this weaponization of the dollar and trying to impose rules on others that Saudi Arabia is just tired of. Saudi Arabia is probably sick of being treated like a gas station and being told to pump more oil or else. Now, if Saudi Arabia joins BRICS, they'll be at the doorstep of forming a new world order. It'll be a new group of commodity giants that has the ability to fight against the financial power of the West. We know the United States and the West have the most sophisticated financial matrix. They control the SWIFT system and could lock out any country from easily transacting with the rest of the world. Russia has learned that lesson firsthand. And even today, a lot of the world's capital is tied up in the West. We just need to look at the US Treasury market alone. In 2021, foreign countries were holding over $7.7 trillion worth of US debt. a third of the total public debt. And because once again, it is seen as a safe haven during a crisis thanks to the dollar's reserve currency status. But the BRICS nations have a huge advantage over the West, which is commodities. For example, China is the biggest producer of gold. India and Brazil are gigantic food exporters. But let's talk about oil. Because if Saudi Arabia joins BRICS, we have a group that controls the majority of the world's oil. We can see the United States tops the list with 18.5% of the world's total oil production. But if we add up the big producers in BRICS such as Russia, China, Brazil, and we include in Saudi Arabia, we will get over 32% of global oil production. And the numbers get even more interesting if we count in OPEC, which controls at least 35% of output. We will get a group that controls over half of global oil production and a majority of exports. And remember, Saudi Arabia is the leader of OPEC. And this is the game changer against the petrodollar system. Just imagine a scenario where the BRICS countries, including Saudi Arabia, suddenly announces to the world that oil can now be bought using the national currencies of the BRICS members in addition to US dollars. So now if you want to buy oil, you can also use the yuan, the rupee or the ruble. You don't just need dollars anymore. And because the moment you hold dollars, you're at risk of the Western financial system. Your dollar holdings could get blocked from the SWIFT system, or your assets could get frozen if US sanctions you. So there's a counterparty risk to just holding the greenback. The US dollar is already below 60% of global currencies, and if oil is no longer just sold in dollars exclusively, there'll be less incentive to hold the currency. Countries will start to diversify their risks away and start stacking currencies from the BRICS nation. Saudi Arabia will also hold less risk by selling their oil in other currencies. There's going to be tremendous synergy between the BRICS nations if Saudi Arabia really joins the bloc. They are essentially self-sufficient. Food from India and Brazil, metals from South Africa, finished goods from China, and most importantly, energy from Russia and Saudi Arabia. And let's talk about defense. Now, this is a big issue that underpins the petrodollar arrangement. Saudi Arabia sells their oil for dollars in exchange for American security guarantees, and a big part of it is weapons sales. Now, let's be clear, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia isn't located in the most peaceful region in the world. One of Saudi Arabia's biggest worries is Iran. So it's natural for Saudi Arabia to want to have some defense guarantees from the United States in exchange for subsidizing the petrodollar system. However, there have been calls by US politicians to stop weapons sales to the country, which is in a sense breaking one half of the petrodollar agreement. America wants Saudi Arabia to reverse their oil production cuts by using the stick of weapons sales. We have Chris Coons, a US senator, saying, "I think you'll see both the administration and the Senate take action, and one of the most likely actions is to stop any future arms sales." Now, obviously, if you're MBS and you hear a statement like this, you probably need to find alternatives for your national security. The Saudis can't approach NATO because they will side with the Americans, and that's why the only option that makes sense is BRICS. Now, back in July, Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Prince Faisal told CNN that if his country fails to get US arms, they will look for alternative supplies. He specifically said, "We are always looking for what is best for us, what fits our technological needs, but we are not going to make ourselves exclusive to one supplier or the other because this doesn't make commercial sense." And he's completely right. If you restrict yourself to one supplier, even if the products are good, they could fleece you on the price, or they could just halt their sales to you and you're screwed. And if you take a look at the world's biggest arm exporters, we can see the United States is clearly in the lead at 39%, but just Russia and China of the BRICS bloc makes up 23% of arms exports, so it's not impossible for Saudi Arabia to get their weapons from the BRICS nations. Even India is growing their defense manufacturing, aiming to export $5 billion worth of arms by 2025. So America truly isn't the only weapons marketplace for the Saudis. With BRICS, they can shop around and do all sorts of bilateral deals without using the dollar. They can sell oil to India for arms, or they could buy weapons from China using the Chinese yuan. It's a very flexible arrangement once you bypass the petrodollar system. And if America stops selling arms, Saudi Arabia can get them elsewhere and they no longer have to stick to the petrodollar agreement. So Saudi Arabia joining BRICS could mean a lot of things to the world. They can swing the prices of oil, establish new security agreements, But let's just focus on the dollar, because if the petrodollar system is broken up, it will cause a lot of pain to the US economy. And we need to understand why the end of the petrodollar is so disastrous for the US. It eliminates two powerful advantages they have, and it is these two things that gave the United States the leeway to become the superpower it is today. Now, firstly, America's ability to borrow money at dirt cheap interest rates will be over. This means much slower economic growth and local consumption will crater. The US is the world's biggest consumer market, and it is all because of cheap credit. Because the dollar was the reserve currency, oil exporters including Saudi Arabia, they did something called petrodollar recycling. Basically, they took their dollar holdings and they bought up a whole bunch of US treasuries. They do it to earn some yield on their reserves, and the rest of the world, they followed suit and began dumping their dollar cash into treasuries as well. So trillions of dollars they have been pouring to US bonds, keeping their yields ultra low. Just look at the 10-year yield across history. The US had 40 years of declining rates and cheap borrowing costs. And when the petrodollar system breaks, other countries will start holding fewer dollars and less money will flow back into treasuries. We're going to see yields go up and stay up. Companies won't be able to borrow as much money, consumers can't spend as much, and the US economy won't be able to grow just as fast. The era of cheap credit will be over. And the second ability the US will lose is the power to print money and get away with it. And this is the most powerful weapon the Federal Reserve has to keep the US economy healthy in the short term at the expense of the whole world. Now, since 2008, every time the American economy started to slow down or crash, the default response was to fire up the printing presses and do quantitative easing. The Fed would print money and flood the system with liquidity to save the economy. However, it comes at the cost of inflation down the road. It doesn't happen immediately. Now let's go back to 2020 when the Fed printed up trillions of dollars. Powell took the balance sheet from $4 trillion to over $9 trillion. But inflation wasn't instant. It took around 12 months for inflation to work through the system and manifest itself. It went from under 2% in early 2020 all the way to 5% in just a year, and today it's over 8% easily. But here's the amazing thing about having the reserve currency. Everyone holds your currency, so there's an ocean of dollars around the world that you can dilute. You gain the immediate effects of money printing, which is propping up your economy, but the rest of the world gets the hidden tax, which is inflation. You exported your inflation away. A smaller country can't get away with that. They'll probably go into hyperinflation. But if the dollar loses its reserve status, there will be nowhere to hide. The money printing games will become immediately apparent, and the Federal Reserve will lose its favorite weapon of choice. And that's why the US government, they've been fighting tooth and nail for decades to keep the dollar as the de facto currency of choice. But what they seem to have forgotten is the fundamentals of what a currency is. They forget that the dollar is backed by oil, and the moment that backing goes away, it is just a piece of paper. And that's why world events like this are extremely important to watch. The conventional idea of investing in the S&P for 10% a year forever, that hinges on the United States still possessing the reserve currency status, and the moment they lose it, a deadly cycle of events will happen that will cause the US to be less competitive. Now, it doesn't mean that the country will melt down in total chaos, but the US economy will be on a more equal footing with the rest of the world. And if you're American, your mortgage rate will shoot up and government borrowing will get tougher. It could even mean defaulting on the national debt or spending cuts to social security, and healthcare could happen. Maybe even the defense budget could get slashed. And we're already seeing the effects of yields rising from this currency crisis. Central banks around the world have already dumped $1 trillion in reserves this year alone to defend their currencies from devaluation against the dollar. Japan is dumping, India is selling, and China is betting against the dollar as well. Now just imagine once the reserve status is lost, countries will start offloading their dollars because it will be less useful. Some will dump it to buy gold, others will buy up US assets like farmland and real estate. But either way, this flood of dollars rushing back into the States will cause higher inflation and potentially trigger a debt crisis because there's a lesser desire to buy US bonds. So you can see the domino effect of the events that can transpire if the petrodollar system breaks. Saudi Arabia holds all the cards today, and if the US actually stops arms sales to the kingdom, this will almost guarantee the move towards BRICS. We'll see more bilateral deals start to happen, new security arrangements will be made, and the dollar's days will be numbered. So let me know what you think. Will Saudi Arabia join the BRICS bloc? Will the US make things worse by punishing Saudi Arabia? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.